Welcome back to the CPA Revolution. I'm Charina Padilla here with our tax strategy expert and co-host, certified tax coach and CPA, Jose Ortiz. If you are tired of traditional reactive CPA advice and want to turn taxes into a wealth building tool, you are in the right place. Hi, everyone. Thank you for another week and for staying tuned to our CPA Revolution. Today's topic is tax problems, right? More often than not, what people think or see as problems is that they actually don't have systems in place. And that's why those tax bills feel so personal when they hit. Not because something suddenly went wrong, but because the decisions that created them were never connected. So this episode today isn't about deductions or deadlines. It's about how money moves and how decisions get made and why taxes are usually the receipt, not the mistake. So today, once again, we're here with Jose Ortiz and hope you guys enjoy this conversation before your taxes start to feel expensive.
That's right, Charina. So I know you're a big sports fan, right, Charina? So
I try to. My husband does a better job than I do on that aspect.
yeah, so there's this guy. He's a Hall of Fame coach. He's passed on several years back. His name was John Wooden. He's a coach for the UCLA Bruins. He won 10, I think it was 10 straight national championships. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I was reading his book again, and this is one of my favorite books, Pyramid of Success. But one of the things that stuck out to me was that, this guy is extremely successful, and he recruited the top talent in the nation. But then when he had his first session of the year, when all the team got together, that very first session, guess what he was teaching his players about? How to put on your socks and your sneakers. So you can imagine if you're one of these guys and you go and you're like, why are you teaching us this? But his thinking was the following, right? The little things, stressing those little things are what lead to success. So basically teaching these players how to properly put on their socks and their sneakers prevents other things from happening. So for example, if they get a blister, right, it might get infected. If it gets infected, they're going to start favoring their other foot. Then that opens up possibilities to twist your ankle, sprain your ankle, tear your knee apart, things like that, because that's really how he saw it. He saw that those little things are what make, turn into big consequences. That's something, I don't know if you're familiar with the term butterfly effect, right? Where small little decisions turn into big consequences. And this is exactly what we encounter when we face tax situations, right? And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, because the devil's in the details, but so is the salvation.
So as a business owner, Jose, what's the sock and the shoe that we need to start putting on first?
Well, the first thing that we need to do is we need to realize that if we're going to make decisions for our business or for our real estate investments, we need good data, right? We need good details. The thing about it is, the details require self-discipline. And I don't know about you, Charina, but as far as I go, I'm not self-disciplined every day at the same level, right? We're humans. It's very hard to do that. But what I found is if you have the right systems in place, then you don't necessarily have to rely on the self-discipline. So that way you basically are on top of all the details that you need in order to make sound business decisions, in order to understand where you are right now from a financial position. Because what happens is if you ignore those little things, then you make yourself extremely vulnerable. And you guys at home know exactly what I mean. Vulnerable meaning you got this huge tax bill you didn't expect, and now you have no idea what to do. You go to a CPA, right? And they tell you, hey, this is a situation, we can't do much about it, right? Or they'll tell you in order to tax plan, we would have to fix some of your books. So those are the kind of situations that you get into, and that winds up being so much more expensive in terms of time, effort, money, then you should have just established the right systems in the first place. And that's what we try to teach our clientele here. And that's what we're talking about today. What kind of systems do we want to implement? Should we consider implementing as a real estate investor, as a business owner, right? Because, nothing is made better through inattention. We want to be paying attention to the little things in our businesses and our real estate investments. So starting off, let's talk about bookkeeping. Now, Charina, you deal with a lot of clients, right? For cost sakes, for R&D credit. Tell me how important bookkeeping is for you in order to do your job.
Well, bookkeeping, it's pretty much the structure, right? So for a real estate investor, for example, that's looking to take advantage of a cost segregation deduction, sometimes they don't know or have all the
Right.
details to see how powerful this strategy is going to be for them, whether they're doing it at the entity level or if they are doing just their usual recording processes. I have many investors that may have 5 to 8 properties that they're still doing their bookkeeping themselves, but they
Right.
don't do it on a frequent basis, right? Instead of doing it
Right.
on a monthly basis, sometimes they're doing it once or twice per year, and that ends up hurting you at the end of the day. More advanced
Right.
investors, obviously, they partner with the individuals that have experience doing bookkeeping for real estate investments. So then that flows a lot easier when they do get those projections. They can easily see what the tax savings will be ahead of time.
No, and that's great feedback because, there's that saying, if you're doing everything, you're doing nothing, right?
Mm,
And on top of that, if you're doing something that you're not necessarily trained to do, you haven't been schooled to do, then you're taking away from the time that you have in order to deliver the value, right, to your clients based on what you do well. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, they come to you, and if their documents are not in order, if their paperwork's not in order, if their records are not in order, that's a risk. But it's not only a risk for them, it's a risk for you, right?
mhm.
It's a risk for CPAs. So
Right.
that's why it's so important to get this thing right. And I'm, like some people out here that may be listening may be like, well, just get to the tax planning. We're not talking to you. We're talking to the people who are motivated, are geared towards, being the best in their business, right? Getting all of those T's crossed, all those I's dotted, all that kind of stuff. That's who we're kind of aiming this to, because we need to understand this, because Charina, they don't teach us this stuff, right? They don't teach us how to balance a checkbook in high school or college, right? They sure as heck don't teach us about taxes, right? So we need to get the right people in place in order to create success. So bookkeeping is the first thing. Think about it as the ground, the basement. I guess if you're pouring the concrete, if your business, real estate, or if it's a regular business, you're pouring that concrete. You want to make sure that that's a solid concrete, that everything's leveled, that everything's in place before you build on top of that, right?
Yeah.
That's why systems are so important. That's why bookkeeping is so important.
Bookkeeping is not the same as tax preparation. So,
No, not at all. And that leads us to our next one, income, right? So I want to start talking about systems for all of these different things. We started with bookkeeping, but let's talk about income. Does income, when I talk about it, mean make more money? No, it doesn't. We need to understand and have systems in place to understand how the income comes in. Is it recurring? Is it one-off? Does it swing all over the place? Or having those systems create predictability, right? So we can kind of start seeing a seasonal flow or whatever it may be, but we need to understand how that income flows throughout the company, right? So that's the second thing. So I would say, hey, make sure your bookkeeping is in place, but then start creating systems to understand how your income is coming in,
mhm.
particularly like for real estate, if you think about that, because real estate cash flow behaves really, really differently from, say, a business, right? So we need to really understand those income patterns, right? Because then once we understand those income patterns, then we can create predictability, and then predictability will open up the floor for tax strategy.
Love that. And what's the third option?
Third is cash flow. So you're like, wait a minute, income and cash flow, what is that? Isn't it all the same thing? No. So revenue isn't cash, right? Bank balance certainly isn't cash, and it's definitely not a plan. Although I see a lot of people using their bank as their piggy bank for their business, which is, obviously a problem in and of itself. But the cash flow is understanding that every single dollar that comes into your business has a job, right?
Mhm.
And there's ways that we help our clients do that, right? So every dollar that comes in, we basically take a look at their patterns, their income patterns, and all that stuff, and their expenditure patterns, and we decide what the proper allocation percentage is to allocate to those particular areas. So tax is one of them, right? So we might do a 30% of whatever dollar comes in goes into your tax bank account. Things like that, because it makes it so much easier at the end of the day. Well, let's call it at the end of the tax year to see
Mhm.
exactly where you are, and then talk about being valuable for your CPA. If you're able to hand them this stuff, right, him or her, and they're able to just file early, right, effectively with minimal questions and all that kind of stuff, how valuable is that for you? How valuable is it for your time?
Yeah, it's so, so important. And not only be valuable, and have meaningful conversations with your CPA. But that last month in the year is your last opportunity to make the right decisions that are going to set you up for success, right? And
Absolutely.
having those numbers clearly laid out on paper is the best decision or the best opportunity that you are going to have to make any last minute investments, purchase new equipment for your company,
Exactly.
get ahead of the game. Because once January 1st hits, it's over. Now you're starting a whole new year.
That's right. That's correct. Yes. So then, I alluded to, your bank being a piggy bank, right? So that kind of is a good segue for the next system that I recommend, and is a compensation system. So how do most owners pay themselves? They do it emotionally, right? They put it based on whatever their personal expenditures are, whatever their needs are.
Right.
And that's dangerous because number one, depending on what type of entity you have, you may be required to pay yourself a salary, a determined salary, something called reasonable compensation, right? So the IRS expects you to get paid similar to someone else in your demographic, in your area, and so forth, based on what you do, right? So having a compensation system where we analyze that compensation every single year keeps you above the board, keeps you compliant, right? And especially if you have records that support all of those salary determinations, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing. Not only that, but and I'm talking to you, S corp owners in particular, right? We have to be conscious. We've talked about this before about basis, right? How much you have invested in your business, right? So basis is critical. And if you don't have a compensation system that looks at all of those items, and plans, say, your distributions for the year as much as possible, then you could run a risk of, right, being non-compliant, or basically being taxed long-term capital gains because you weren't aware that your basis was at zero, right?
Right.
And I highly recommend that people go back to that particular episode to kind of learn more about that, because it's crucial. So that's compensation.
Mhm.
For investors, it's deciding how much, we have a real estate portfolio. How much are we going to keep in our portfolio, right, for reinvestment, for all those kind of things, versus how much we're going to take out, right? So from that perspective, you have your rental incomes, and those are predictable, I would say, right? So that gives you guys an added benefit, because then you know what's coming in the door, right? You don't maybe not know it to the number, but you know more or less what's coming out. So you can literally, if you're sitting with the right CPA, plan out your year. Plan out your year for growth, plan out your year for compensation, and so forth, just by doing these things.
Yeah, all of those details are super useful, and I'm glad that you mentioned those items. I
Yeah.
would love to get into like the entity structures. This is a question that I always get asked by investors. Like, how does
Yeah.
the entity structure work? What's the best entity for my business, right? Can
Yeah.
you take us into a little more detail on how you approach those type of questions?
Yeah. So entity structure, a lot of people think it's set it and forget it, right? So you set it up this one time, you set up your LLC, whatever it may be, and you're done. But the reality is that your business or your investment structure may change. So that's why every year when I'm sitting with these clients, we want to make sure that we evaluate what their entity structure is. Not only should my LLC be a S corp or a C corp or whatever it may be, right? But also, how does it look in the grand scheme of things? What do we have in place? How does it work with other entities that you may have in your portfolio, particularly like real estate investors, where you have different LLCs and all that kind of stuff? How do those all play together? What's the most effective way to grab all of those entity structures and have them working in unison? Right, in a flow income pattern, and cash flow and all that kind of stuff. So that's one of the things that is so key, particularly for, like, real estate investors always have those questions, should I do an LLC, should I do an S corp, and all these other kind of things. But the answer to that is it's a year by year thing. You want to keep analyzing based on how your portfolio grows, based on what your needs are, your objectives are, and so forth.
Yeah, I love that. And it's just a matter of reviewing and recalibrating based on what's going on with your business, because
Exactly.
we all want to continue growing, and the same systems that we have in place as a startup may not benefit you as you start getting into the 7 and 8 digit figures. So definitely, I love all of this information, and we want to bring these details to our audience to make sure that they're asking the right questions when they're meeting with their CPAs. It is that season, and sometimes we just don't know what to ask, right?
And like, the real estate investors, and I guess business owners to a certain degree, but it happens more with real estate investors. I find that a lot of them don't necessarily have a plan for acquiring and
Mhm.
owning these properties, right? So they don't have a system for analyzing, a deal. They don't have a system for analyzing, okay, how should this ownership structure look, right? So that's the other thing, because obviously, depending on, what kind of deals you want, you might need a different type of entity, depending on what you're doing, whether it's you're a dealer or wholesaler versus a fix and flip or a burr guy. All those things matter, right? And how do we make the decisions? How do we make those acquisitions? What is the thought process that goes into that? And then
Mhm.
related to that, Charina, is the decision system. So you can imagine all these little systems that I'm talking about probably flow down right into that decision system, because all of those factors have to come in play in order to make a educated decision. So when these systems exist, then you start kind of noticing, hey, I'm not being reactive. I'm not waking up one morning, taking a look at my financials or whatever it may be, and getting surprised or getting these huge tax bills, because at that point it starts being very systematic and you're taking the proactive measures to get ahead of whatever may be happening. So if you want to know about tax planning, right? If you want a strategy for tax planning, I'll tell you, all you guys at home, the first strategy, right? And I say strategy, not tactics, not the stuff that you see on TikTok. The first strategy is to get your systems in line, get them
Mhm.
updated, spend the time, sweat the small stuff, because those small things turn into larger things in the future. So that's kind of the message that I want to leave you guys with today. I'm always available for chat. I'm always available to talk a little bit more about your personal situation. So by all means, let's get on the phone and start taking control of your financial situation.
Yeah, thank you, Jose. I think for me, if there's one takeaway is that taxes don't become expensive in March or April. They actually become expensive all year long. So when
Yeah,
systems are clear, the income, cash flow, compensation, tax structure, then at that point is when taxes stop feeling reactive, right? And then you can find that comfort that you're doing the right thing. So if
exactly.
you see it coming, you know you have options. And the best thing we can do is continue working towards our goals and documenting everything that we're doing properly and understanding our numbers, and success will find us in the
That's right.
process.
Great job, Serena.
Thank you so much for your time today, and we'll see you on the next session of the CPA Revolution. Thank you for trusting us and supporting us every day.
Take care, everybody.